Hey all, so going to talk about saturation, excitation, vibe, mojo, whatever you want to call it today. Generally, when we speak about these things, we're either talking about two things. One, analog or analog simulated saturation, or B, excitation. Saturation is a bit different, and I can't really go into the specifics of it mathematically. I don't have that knowledge, but in terms of feeling, it's a general feeling of warmth. There's very small amounts of harmonic generation in there, but more it's a feeling of warmth, and there tends to be a little bit of subtle compression on the sound, I find. As well as a little bit of high-end roll-off. That's the general feel that you get from saturation. But the terms saturation and excitation tend to be used a little bit interchangeably. But specifically when I talk about excitation, what I'm talking about is harmonics generation. And there's all sorts of different modes for harmonics generation. You can go out there and look those up. And generally those modes tend to emulate particular kinds of external analog behavior, so tubes, tape, early digital excitation effects, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, they all tend to be generating harmonics one way or the other. So harmonics are essentially taking whatever your frequency is and then taking the doubling of that frequency, and then the doubling of that, and then the doubling of that. That's sort of a very strong simplification of it, but that's kind of the basics of it. So it's generating frequencies that aren't there based on frequencies that are there. So where is this useful? I would say the main thing is a couple of places. One, when you want to make a signal more clear, and two, when you want to basically create some content as part of a sound that wasn't there in the first place. So in terms of the latter, you're thinking in terms of a source that has a lot of low and mid frequencies but no high frequencies. If you generate a lot of harmonics, then you can kind of add a upper end sheen to it where it's generating some high frequencies. For most of the time, though, you tend to be taking something and increasing kind of the clarity of it and the shine of the sound, if you like, by adding harmonics to it. And you can definitely go overboard on this, and I think in most recent years people have started to become aware with the absolute dearth of analog modeled equipment that's out there that you can really go too hard on this front, and you can end up generating too much in the way of harmonics throughout your song. If you use it on every track, then you can end up with a mix that by the end of the day sounds just a little bit, it's hard to describe, it's sort of a peaky kind of a sound. Everything is just a little bit too piercing, or a little bit too, and it's sort of a little bit hard to put your finger on. And if you're getting to that point where you're going, oh, I have to roll off a whole bunch of highs on the mix because it's just kind of sounding just a little bit painful somehow, then you may have added too much in the way of harmonics. So in terms of plugins, obviously there's plugins that are specifically designed to add harmonics or saturation. That's what they do. And then there's plugins which, as part of their analog modeling, end up adding saturation or excitation of some sort. And a lot of the analog modeled stuff does this. So a lot of the virtual console stuff, a lot of the virtual compressor stuff, all adds some kind of sound on that level. But it's very complicated once you get to that point, because it's not as straightforward as just, harmonics and excitation. It's usually all sorts of weird analog mojo that's going into it. More recently, I think a lot of people, including myself, have started to realize, hey, we've sort of gone a bit too far on this analog modeled front. Let's pull it back a little bit. There are some strong advantages to just straight, clean digital plugins, right? A straight, clean, well-designed digital EQ is, I think, probably a very good starting point. Because with anything that's analog modeled, with anything that's adding saturation and overtones and harmonics and whatever, you can kind of get a really nice sound really quickly, but you're kind of doing it by adding stuff in, and by the time you get to the end of the mix, you may end up with that peaky feel. So it can sometimes be better off just starting with straight digital tools for that first pass of EQ, and just getting that sound the way you want it without analog modeling, without adding harmonics or whatever. And then once you've kind of gotten everything into a reasonably transparent, good state, then maybe you start to think about, adding analog this, analog that, some harmonics. As with all mixing, there's no real hard and fast rules. It's all about how good things sound. But I know for my own part, when I started off, and particularly when I was doing stuff in the early 2000s, all I had access to was just digital EQs and stuff, and I ended up getting some very good, quite transparent mixes in that way. Now, I've got a lot of analog modeled stuff, and I'm still getting mixes that I really like, but I'm sort of missing some of the openness and the transparency that I got with some of those earlier mixes. So I'm starting to go back a little bit and thinking, okay, I just want to work with some stuff that's just clean for a while. It's kind of ironic because back in the days, the 80s and 90s and stuff, a lot of what people were trying to get away from were all the disadvantages of analog technology, all the hiss and all the character that was imparted, the low-end rumble of tape or whatever. It's a whole bunch of different analog issues that came up that people were like, oh, we just want to get away from this. And now it's all gone the reverse, and everybody's like, oh, okay, got to have that analog modeled stuff, got to have that hiss, And the funny thing is that small amounts of hiss and small amounts of, warping or whatever are part of what give particular things their sound. And the great thing about being the age that we're in is that we can chop and change, and we can say, okay, I want this on this track, but I don't want any of that tape warping on this track. And we can really choose on the basis of aesthetics and what makes things sound good, rather than on the basis of, well, that's all I've got and that's all I've got access to. So great time to be mixing. It's a shame that there's not much money to be made in music anymore comparatively, but it is a fantastic time to be making music in all other respects. So yeah, good time to be alive.